As it turns out, the answer isn't as straightforward as we portrayed it. So this graph shows various scenarios in which we have the tons of CO2 emitted by an internal combustion engine and various different types of electricity used in a very specific battery electric vehicle, which is called the Polestar 2. There are different methods or different ways in which electricity is mixed with the power grid in different places, and this is how these different scenarios can be seen. So the first one is the yellow one, where there is the global average electricity mix. So as you can see with this one, at about 112 kilometers, that's the break-even point at which the electric vehicle becomes better in terms of energy emissions than the internal combustion engine, which is in red. You can see similarly that the European electricity mix is a bit earlier, so around 78,000 kilometers. And when it comes to just using simply wind power, so a purely renewable source of electricity, it's the best part, so essentially around 50,000 kilometers. So as you can see, the graph in purple is almost horizontal, which essentially indicates that the largest amount of emissions that's taking place for the battery electric vehicle is at the point of manufacture, mostly because of the battery that's involved. This leads us to actually talking about what life cycle assessment is. So essentially the tool that is required to answer these sort of questions mostly is doing a life cycle assessment. What exactly it is? So life cycle assessment addresses the environmental impacts and potential environmental impacts, for example, the use of resources and environmental consequences of releases through a product's life cycle from raw material acquisition throughout production, use, and also end-of-life treatment, recycling, and final disposal. So essentially it's kind of a cradle-to-grave approach of analysis. Throughout this lecture course, we're going to talk about various different examples, but also this very specific examples that concerns with different types of vehicles. So there was a 2020 EU Commission report in which they wanted to determine the environmental impacts of both conventional and alternatively fueled vehicles using the LCA approach. And essentially there are two general standards which we will talk about in a few minutes. And this report essentially follows these two standards to do this LCA. So the graph you can see on your screen is a comparison with this study and other studies that they've done at the time. Particularly, this study is more expansive in terms of scope in comparison to the other studies, which is why we're using this study as a reference point or as a general example throughout the period of this course. We will also look at other more simpler examples from our lab, but this is just to give you a reference to take a look after you've looked at this lecture. There are four main stages for doing any life cycle assessment, and generally these are the goal and scope definition, followed by inventory analysis, impact assessment, and also interpretation. Inventory analysis is often abbreviated as LCI, and impact assessment is abbreviated as LCIA. We're going to be using these abbreviations throughout this course, so it would be nice that you don't confuse yourself that much with these. And also it makes sense to know that these aren't atomic stages, so you always go back and forth between these stages when you need to do so. The goal of the LCA study, so the first part of what an LCA is, so we're going to follow the ISO 1440 definition of an LCA goal. Essentially what it states is the intended application of the LCA, the reasons for carrying out the study, the intended audience, and also whether the results are intended to be used in a comparative assertion released publicly. So these are very important things that you should state at the very beginning of your LCA, because it determines not only how you do the LCA and also how long it takes. For example, the 2020 EU study had the intended application for being a representative selection of road vehicle configurations. It aims to enhance the EU Commission's understanding of environmental impacts and also of suitable methodologies to assess them in the mid to long range term time frame, which is around until 2050. And their target audience was quite obviously the EU Commission itself and also decision makers in general. So now that we know a little bit about the goal of an LCA study and what exactly it is, we talk about the scope. So the scope of an LCA study describes this thing called a functional unit of the system. We will talk exactly what this is. It also defines reference flows, the system boundary, the LCIA methodology and types of impacts that are being analyzed, potential limitations of the study, and also data quality requirements of your study. So firstly, we talk about what functional units are. So to be defined very easily, these are a quantified performance of a product system for use as a reference unit. So for example, you can have 1 million holes drilled for a particular system involving a drill. A reference flow is highly related to a functional unit, and to be defined, this is a measure of the outputs from processes in the given product system that are required to deliver the performance defined by your functional unit. So to put it in other words, it's a measure of the products or product parts required to deliver the performance required by your functional unit. So we're going to look a little bit into these two terms with the example of the EU study. So they defined very specific functional units and reference flows in their study. So these essentially vary by the type of bodies or the body types of the vehicles. So as you can see, for the body type of passenger cars, the default reference flow was vehicle kilometers. This is because the primary function of a passenger car is to transport people. But in terms of something like a rigid lorry or an Arctic lorry, the default reference flow is in ton kilometers because the default function of such vehicles is to transport stuff, which is generally measured in terms of how much they weigh. To further understand the difference and comparison between functional units and reference flows, we're going to take a short detour into mushroom production. At our lab at ETCE, we did a project involving mushrooms called MushR. And in here we did a mini LCA, which might be helpful to look at during this course. So to gain a little bit of an introduction or background into mushrooms, we have this thing called substrate, which is the medium from which mushrooms grow. Essentially, it can be composed out of wheat or straw pellets or also sawdust. And substrate containers essentially contain the substrate throughout the entirety of the substrate's lifespan. So as you can see on the right, we have two different types of containers. On top, we have the MushR containers that we created, and also the traditional method, which are plastic bags. After inoculation, what we do is we make small ventilation holes, which are filtered for facilitating incubation. And after incubation, we make fruiting holes into these containers, which are opened. And essentially what happens here is that the contained substrate is exposed to fresh air and high humidity. This allows mushrooms to grow through these holes. And after some fruiting cycles, the substrate inside is discarded and composted. So traditionally, the substrate containers, so the plastic bags that you see on the bottom, are made out of polypropylene, and these are usually sealed by folding the end opening several times. Essentially, this can be very tricky to seal and also needs to be reopened for inoculation. But more importantly, the fruiting holes are permanent, and they are basically made by cutting through the bags, and they cannot be reused. The biggest problem of these bags is that they are single-use only. So we tried to fix this problem by creating substrate pods using plastic polypropylene buckets. So contrast to the plastic bags, these are sealed by a plastic lid, so they're trivial to seal and unseal. The fruiting holes are still permanent and are drilled into the bucket, but these are sealed with microporous tape during incubation, and the tape can be just removed for fruiting mushrooms, so basically they can be reused. But there is a catch here, is that there is higher resource consumption required for production of these buckets in the first place. There is also a more complicated manufacturing process because these are not the same type of container. So the question might arise, exactly which one is better? Is all the research that we did and all the experimentation even worth it? Should we really go forward with these substrate pods? To answer this question, we put a goal for ourselves to compare the environmental impact of our developed mushroom pods with the non-reusable substrate bags by using life cycle assessment calculations. So this is where we come to the functional unit and reference flow example. So the question would be, how would we define the functional unit for a mushroom substrate container? So because the primary function of a mushroom substrate container is to have colonizable substrate inside of it, we can define the functional unit in terms of the colonizable volume of the container itself. In our case, our container was 3 liters. What about the reference flow? So this we can do in terms of the amount of polypropylene in grams. So essentially this comes up to the weight of the container itself. So try to remember, the reference flow is a measure of the products or product parts required to deliver the performance defined with a functional unit. So our functional unit was colonizable volume, and what we need to achieve this is a certain amount of polypropylene for making our container.